So now we are going to move to our highly anticipated first panel of the day, which is, of course, our airline panel, which is going to be moderated by somebody whose name will be familiar to most of you in the room and familiar to all of you who attended Aviadev 2023, because she did a brilliant job of moderating the panel last year as well. Hilka Birns is an award-winning journalist with the Swiss-based airline news and intelligence service ch-aviation, who are a really long-term partner of mine and of Aviadev's as well. And I'm sure lots of you go there for your news and your analysis. She's known for her tenacity, her determination, her directness, and her fairness as well. So I'm sure this session is going to be no different. So please join me in welcoming Hilka to the stage. But again, Hilka, nice and slow, because we'd love to have some more music from Susie. Hilka.
Thank you. The lion sleeps tonight. Good morning, everyone. Exciting to see you in Namibia. I have a special love for this country because about 1 million years ago, I started here as a journalist, reporting about agriculture, sea fisheries, and nature conservation. So much has changed, but it always feels like I'm coming home. So thank you, John, for bringing us here. Now let's get to the topic, the interplay of access to aircraft finance and markets and its impact in shaping route development. To help us unpack this and chart a course forward, please welcome to the stage Adedayo Olawuyi, the Chief Commercial Officer of Uganda Airlines. Please make your way to the stage. Rodger Foster, CEO and Managing Director of Airlink. If you take the second seat, yeah. Sanjeev, Gadhia, founder and CEO of Astral Aviation, all the way from Kenya. Nowel Ngala, board member and chief commercial officer of TAAG, Angola Airlines. And last but not least, Tebogo, Tsimane, interim chief commercial officer of South African Airways. Now, as they make their way to the stage, I'd like you to open the poll. Please open up your apps. And the question to you in the audience is the following. Which is the most crucial requirement for accessing aircraft finance? Is it a feasible business plan, a clean balance sheet, reputable leadership, or government support without interference? So please go ahead and vote, and we'll reveal the results at the end of the session. So welcome, everyone. Good morning.
Morning.
Lovely to see you here. Route development and access to markets. That needs appropriate equipment, which requires access to aircraft finance. The reality is we have long order backlogs and delivery delays in new aircraft, and we've got high lease rates in used aircraft. Analysts are predicting that the African market will remain undersupplied until 2027. All this constrains route development and operational efficiency. At the same time, we heard from Airbus yesterday that Africa will need around 1,200 additional aircraft in the next 20 years. So how are we going to finance all of this? Rodger, can you sketch us, sort of as a background, the market realities in Africa when it comes to accessing aircraft finance?
I think there's always an optimistic view about the number of aircraft that need to come into Africa to satisfy the markets. I have a different view. My view is that Africa's got a large population, 1.4 billion people, very similar to India, very similar to China. We sit with 55 countries, 55 sets of regulations, different competitions authorities. But I think the key driver for me that brings about the requirement for air travel in the first instance is affordability. And when I hear the point that the GDP per capita in certain areas, pockets of excellence within parts of Africa. I think that's all plausible. But when you take a look at the whole continent and you see the GDP per capita, I think the reality check for me goes about how affordable is air travel. And air access and the supply of air access has to follow the market. It's not the other way around. You know, the market is about economic well-being of societies within Africa. So I think that there's optimism and there's reality. The reality for me is the market is not as big as everybody would have believed. I think the reality is we need to live within our means, and we have to supply in accordance with the market demands. And that's not the optimistic figure that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we need a market rationalization at the moment? Is there an overcapacity?
Well, we certainly see it in certain markets within Africa. You know, interestingly, and I've given the figure of population in Africa, 1.4 billion people, and approximately 55 countries. Why I say approximately? Because sometimes one is in and sometimes it's out, Madagascar and Mauritius, whether they're part of Africa or not. But, you know, the number of airlines operating in Africa, according to IATA statistics, over 400. No, I mean, that's just unsustainable. You know, even if I take a look at the sub-region Southern Africa, the number of airlines that we've got relative to the size of the market, and that goes about disposable income, I think we've got far too many competing airlines. And if we ever going to develop an industry premised on viability and on economies and efficiencies of scale, there needs to be rationalization, and there needs to be consolidation, and there needs to be collaboration, and the number can't be 400. It has to be a much smaller number. If you take a look at the number of viable airlines operating in the subcontinent of India, that's one country with one set of regulations, one competitions authority, and so on. Less than 10 airlines are sustainable in that environment. We saw earlier on in those economic graphs, India's economy is one of the fastest growing economies on earth at the moment. And you could justify on the basis of that there is going to be disposable income amongst society in India. Therefore, the need for air access and air travel follows. So the same is true to China, for example. They've got a relatively strong economy which continues growing faster than most economies on earth. They've got a great disposable income per capita. Air access is required. But how many airlines are sustainable in China, or for that matter, India? Less than 10. Why do we think in Africa we can sustain 400 competing airlines? It's just not on. So from my perspective, there has to be consolidation. Even in Southern Africa, there has to be consolidation. You can't sustain so many competing airlines in a market which is diminished.
So financiers and investors are looking at business models, obviously, amongst other things. Nowel, can you sketch us the sort of basic, I think there are about 3 basic general business models that you find amongst airlines in Africa?
Thank you very much, Hilka. The African continent is a very big continent with a demography of over 1.2 billion people. This is a very, very huge market. But the business models for the various African airlines vary according to the region, according to the country, according to what the government wants, according to their approach. We have seen business models that airlines are considered as infrastructure projects. They are not there for any income or revenue generation, or doesn't have any commercial approach. They want to be flag carriers to bring in people into the country. We have seen other business models of national carriers as well that are operating with a commercial perspective, but still have strong open skies with other continents that are allowing other international carriers to fly into their countries from different entry points and plowing back from the revenues of tourism and refinancing the airlines. We have seen other business models of government-owned airlines that are strictly commercially driven with an approach for profitability. But the difference at the end of the day is what the government, because most of the airlines are owned by the government, keeping aside the private airlines that have commercial objectives. They're owned by the government, and the bottom line is what do they want exactly, and which approach do they want to use. In most of the government-owned airlines, we have domestic markets as well that is considered as public service, where operations are basically not profit driven, but they want to serve the population. They want to make sure that there is connectivity. And other airlines also have the challenge of providing this connectivity. But the issue is, like Mr. Rodger said earlier, with the numerous airlines we have in Africa, we see that the concentration is on particular city pairs. Africa still have over about 66% of connectivity that is still lacking, moving from one capital city to the other. We see a huge concentration of traffic or routes and huge frequency deployment and capacity in particular city pairs, isolating other areas where we need to develop more and provide this connectivity. So this is where we need to consider further in terms of requesting for the finance that we need to provide the right aircraft to serve some other city pairs that are lagging behind. And the city pairs that we see this concentration is mostly on the countries that have visa openness policy, which allows for people to freely trade and people to freely travel. Thank you.
When it comes to the financiers, when they look at the business model, what do they want to see? Tebogo, can you give us an insight?
Well, I think everybody is saying it. A viable business plan.
Yeah.
There is, and really, in that business plan, you will unpack what is this viability that we are talking about. Is there a demand? Are we operating in an environment that will enable us to make money? To give the investors a return for their money? Are we operating in an environment that requires the service that you want to have? And do you actually know as well that the equipment that that market requires is what? I mean, we have a situation. We have situations in the continent where we have an airline that has multiple aircraft with different OEMs, with different engine providers, and with no significant demand. So that speaks to the business plan. That's the most important thing. And obviously, you got to have a proper regulatory systems that are in place, where you are not going to have a situation where all of a sudden you wake up and then you are told that the number of frequencies that are in your bilateral, we've now reduced them to 1. Or you are no longer going to fly because we are not happy that another airline of ours was not able to have an agreement with you. So a stable regulatory framework is very important, where everybody knows what they are up for and what they are going to get and what they will not get. I do know that there are other people who are saying that you must also produce profits for you to be able to get financing. I actually don't think that is always the truth. But you must show the financiers that you have a plan that will eventually produce the profits. And when will you be able to produce the profits? In our case, we've just come out of a business rescue. We have been told by our shareholder that we will no longer get 1 cent from our shareholder. So what are we doing? We are taking the business plan to the financiers. And we believe that we have a case and that their financiers, some of them, not all of them, some of them will actually come to the party and say, yes, we agree with what you are doing. And I can tell you that from the conversations that we are having so far, it all boils down to one thing. a very good business plan.
I mean, that is something I want to come back later on as well, but maybe from a private airline perspective, Sanjeev, can you give us an insight as well? You're operating in Kenya, but you are expanding rapidly, and you're operating a cargo airline. Are there any particular market realities that you're looking at, and what are the financiers looking for?
So what I was just saying is that when it comes to the air cargo sector, because of the fact that a lot of cargo aircrafts are generally quite old, it is difficult to get aircraft financing. And in the last 24 years of being in business, it's only this year that we actually did our first sale and leaseback with Avmax, and we're making a major announcement this afternoon. So we are seeing a situation where the availability of aircraft financing is there for newer aircrafts. And we're actually in the middle of a negotiation with Boeing to acquire some new Boeing aircrafts. And the good news is that there is financing available. But that financing is limited in nature, because when you look at the African ECAs, especially African Development Bank and Afri-Exim, they really don't have an innovative financing mechanism for African airlines, especially the ones which are privately owned, because we don't have the privilege of getting a sovereign guarantee from the government. So what we are actually doing is depending more on leased aircrafts. And the good advantage with leased aircrafts is that it comes with a lower risk. But when you look at the impact of leased aircrafts on a balance sheet, it actually shows that your balance sheet is not strong enough, especially when you have assets. So it's a catch-22 situation for airlines like ourselves. When we go to financiers, they're looking for a very strong balance sheet. But because historically we've operated leased aircrafts, we actually have that disadvantage. But because of the fact that we are a profitable airline, we're getting a lot of interest coming in from various ECAs. And of course, we believe that we need more innovation. We need more collaboration between the African ECAs and the foreign ECAs, like, for example, the US Exim Bank and also some of the European-based. But I think there's also another opportunity, which is the Middle Eastern of financiers. You know, you're actually seeing some very innovative products coming in from the Middle East, which are significantly lower in cost. So I believe this is something which is very important, because one of the challenges that is being faced by airlines in Africa is the high cost of financing. And when you look at the margins that we all make, our margins are very, very low. So how do you keep up with the financial repayments and meet the high interest repayments while maintaining profitability is a very big challenge for African airlines, especially those from the private sector who don't get any help from the governments. So this is a constant evolving phase. And in the end, what you do is you just continue doing what is best for the company. And of course, business models is a very interesting topic, because as a cargo airline, we've gone through so many business models. And what we've actually seen that when you have a 5-year business model, it just doesn't work. You have a 3-year business model, it doesn't work. So I really believe that we need to have a yearly business model, because the dynamics are changing so much. You know, you've got the situation with COVID, you've got the Red Sea crisis. So as an airline, how do you actually keep up with all the business models? Because when you take a business model to a financier, it is not valid anymore because of all the assumptions that have actually been made, which are no longer valid. So even when you look at the situation in Africa, the exchange rate crisis in Nigeria, to the elections in South Africa, inflation, the geopolitical situations that are actually taking place in almost 8 countries in Africa, you can never put that in a business plan, because you never know that when you're actually forecasting and projecting that you're going to have such challenges which are coming up. So I really don't believe that it is as much as it is important to have a 5-year and 3-year business plan. What we really do as an airline is we work on a 1-year business plan, and of course we have projections which we have to do for the sake of the airlines the financiers. But we just have to be very realistic that sometimes in all the best cases, no matter how good and honest your intentions are, you can never get it right.
Yeah. So you mentioned COVID. So black swan events is something that is going to be discussed tomorrow at a panel discussion with Tristan Bruat. So that will be interesting to hear how we're going to de-risk our business plans for events like that. How do we de-risk the industry from an investor point of view? Adi, maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
Anyway, from the perspective of a state-owned carrier, a lot of airlines are set up based on the need that there is at the moment. As a government carrier, the government realized there was a need for air transport in the country. Uganda is a small country. Not a lot of you will want to come and bring your money to invest in an airline. So for us, it was a clear need that the government needed to be the one to finance it. And that finance has been ongoing in recent acquisitions of aircraft and the proposed plans we have for the future. The government still continues to support us. However, we know there will have to come a point in time when that money might run dry, where the level of support you get from the government will not continue to be there. And the only way you can ensure that the airline is a growing concern is to ensure profitability. Profitability becomes the only form of sustainability that can help the airline to grow. There are other ways where you can look for raising funds, but as every other panelist there has mentioned, there are different challenges that you face at every point in time. When you do not have the balance sheet that can support getting external investors or getting good financiers, we are operating in Africa where we have almost the highest cost of operation. Anywhere compared to anywhere else in the world, it becomes a very, very big task for people at leadership levels to be able to find ways to make that work. But that being said, there is a lot of potential on the continent. With the 1.4 billion people, we are still just contributing 2.1% of the total number of passengers that are flying, which shows that there is definitely the huge potential on the continent. When it comes to fleet planning and accessing markets, the biggest challenge we have in Africa, like Rodger was mentioning, and I think Nowel also mentioned that, is the fact that you have very, very few trunk markets. The other markets which are underserved or unserved are very, very small markets, which at the end of the day becomes a very, very big challenge for you to be able to get the right equipment, to be able to serve all these kind of various markets that you have. So the plan for every major airline is to be able to have a sustainable network where you can have good connectivity. And that's why all of us need to continue to work together, because you can't just do it by yourself. That's where connections come in, interline agreements, code shares, and see how we are able to grow our own individual networks to a certain extent where we can be profitable. So I think that's the major thing we need to put in perspective when trying to de-risk the airline.
Right. Rodger, what role does good governance play and your balance sheet?
Government play on a balance sheet. I think, well, coming from the private sector, government hasn't got a role to play on our balance sheet.
Sorry,
governance. My apologies. There's an echo in your mic.
Sorry.
I was going to say, through COVID, a lot of governments came to the assistance of airlines, and yes. I don't believe in our case there was any gesturing at all. In fact, they tightened up the credit screws, and all of the government organizations like Air Traffic Navigation Services, the Airports Company, etc., were less forgiving. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about corporate governance.
Yes.
And following corporate governance comes financial discipline within an organization. And I think that we hear about de-risking the industry, de-risking airlines, and attracting investor capital one way or the other. And I think the key element of that is your fiduciary responsibilities to within the organization to de-risk a company and to equip it to be able to deal with the black swan type events, which we've had an abundance of, certainly in my short existence as the CEO of our industry, of our business for the last 32 odd years. We've seen multiple of them, and we're going to see them again in the future. And I think the only way you can prepare a business to be able to ride that storm is by building a balance sheet. And building a balance sheet goes about having a profitable business, which starts off with having a good business model and a good business plan, which predicts the future to some extent, premised on your performance in the history. And I think that that's also an element that any investor would look at a company. They don't just look at your business plan saying, what is your promise going forward? It's about how you have been able to deliver your promise in the history book and convert all of the revenue streams that you have accessible to you into profitability in a sustainable way, and convert that profitability into equity, build the balance sheet on the basis of equity. And the stronger your balance sheet, the better you are equipped to be able to ride out the storm and as I say, attract interest in your business from an investor perspective. But that follows from governance, and the governance starts off at your shareholder level, and how the shareholder, and it's always exciting to have multiple shareholders in an organization, because then you get diverse views, and the commitment of one normally drags the other one with them as well. But the appointment of your board of directors, in our case, we're pretty lucky. We've got almost a full house of chartered accountants, other than for myself, of course. And I think that the wisdom that gets brought from a financial perspective by people who've been seasoned in industry and the multiple businesses in different disciplines of the industry and of the economy, I think that they bring a lot of value to your board. And when it comes to your fiduciary controls, I think it's of paramount importance that it starts off at the governance level, in other words, from the board of directors. But we see it from within the organization as well. We're a tightly disciplined executive leadership team. We pay a lot of attention to management accounting, to the detail of performance of every route, of every single flight, every single day of the week. We've got an organization which is rich in data, and I believe that you need that to be able to correctly govern an organization, whatever it is. We have business informatics available at our fingertips every day, every minute of every day if we wish that. And I think that your financial controls are of paramount importance. And you have a look at your route performance, your flight performance by route. If you've got underperforming activity, best you arrest it very quickly, because when you look at the margins of an airline business, I was at the IATA conference just a short while ago, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, and Willie Walsh talking about, in good times, 4% net margin. 4% net margin, when you think about the turnovers of business, of airline business, and the capital that is invested in airline business, a 4% net margin is nothing. And it's very easy to get it wrong. It's very difficult to get it right. And when we take a look at the history of airline failures in Africa, we've got a long way to go to instill enthusiasm and interest in airline businesses in Africa, where we've had so many failures in the past. So I think that from within the organization, you need to have your fingers on the pulse all the time. And from outside of the organization, as we are influenced by our shareholders and our directors, I think governance is of paramount importance. And by the way, it's not just your board of directors. Your financial stakeholders are not just your shareholders. Your lessors are your financial stakeholders. Your lenders are your financial stakeholders. And they all influence how you perform and how you keep your fingers on the pulse of the business, and how you respond to situations where, if you have to curb underperforming activity, that you actually get on with it and do it, so that you can show them that you know what you're doing with your business. Thank you.
And quickly, Sanjeev, leadership. I mean, often people look at the leadership of an airline, and the strength of that they invest. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And leadership is very, very important for every airline. And of course, the gentleman sitting here next to me is a perfect example of good leadership in the private sector in Africa. And leadership is really important, and the success and failure of an airline really depends on good leadership. And especially when you look at leadership when it comes to state-owned airlines, which are politically driven, that can actually really be a very big problem for financiers and also for stakeholders, because they need some stability. And a good example is when you look at Ethiopian Airlines and the leadership that you've seen over there, we've actually noticed that the leadership is very strong, very solid. And of course, we still remember the leadership of Ato Garma Wake, who is also somebody who we really miss him in this event. So I really believe that leadership plays a very, very important part. And in addition to leadership, I also believe that there's the importance of corporate governance, the importance of having discipline and resilience, but also above everything is accountability, to be responsible for your decisions and actually accepting ownership of that, because you've got a very big number of people who depend on your leadership. So I really feel that these are things which are very, very important. And I believe also there's one more area which I think is important is having ethical business practices. So as a cargo airline, we have very, very strong ethics when it comes to the transportation of certain cargoes, such as conflict minerals, gold, animal trophies, arms and ammunitions. These are things that we get emails on a regular basis. And of course, we do a lot of work for the United Nations. So I really believe that there are certain principles and values which are very, very important, which when combined with good leadership, good corporate governance, are all very strong pillars for an airline. And I believe to a certain extent, financiers look at balance sheets, but when they look at leadership and the consistency of the leadership, I believe these are things which are very, very important.
Thank you. Nowel, when we look at the regulatory landscape, we have restrictions on foreign ownership and control of airlines in various markets. They're different. South Africa is 25%. What role does that play when you're looking for investment in an airline? Is it a restriction? Is it an impediment?
Thank you, Hilka, once again. The issue of ownership, it's very critical, and I think it's supposed to be considered according to the regions and the continent. I think ownership, for example, in the US is about 72%. In Europe is about 52%. But in Africa, we still need a lot of support. Because if you compare Europe and the US, where they already have the means, they already have strong financial institutions, and they have the equity, Africa is still growing. Africa is still a baby. So I think the consideration for ownership should shift a little bit and be opened up so that we can have the right financiers and lenders to be able to assist. We shouldn't really over-focus and compare to others and focus on ownerships being limited only to Africans. My point of view.
Rodger, but that goes back to the Chicago Convention, doesn't it? Those restrictions.
Yeah, and I think that we see around the world adaptability of how markets have changed. And, the Chicago Convention, 1944, predicated ownership and control being vested within a state for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think that, in the modern world today, one has to look at sources of capital and where the capital would come from to invest in. And although I think most states in Africa have regulations which are prohibitive from an ownership and control perspective, and that in itself becomes a debate because they're all open to interpretation, and we know about that in South Africa at the moment. It's one of the hot topical issues.
Yeah, we're not going there.
No, we're not going there. No, we're not going to debate that. Where's Kirby? He'd probably not be very happy if we debated in this forum, and we can't, unfortunately. But what we can say is that there is an abundance of capital that is ready to invest in Africa. But that capital also looks at the concept of a 25% stake in a business, which is a minority stake and without minority protection interests specifically. And I think that probably has to change, because if you take a look at the Goliaths of the industry based in the Middle East, based in the United Kingdom, based in America, they're ready to invest their capital, but on the basis that their capital is risk-averse, firstly, and then secured, and that they would have a say commensurate with the amount of capital that they would invest.
But
So
the
I think
reason why, sorry to interrupt, but the reason goes back to the Chicago Convention from 1944,
Yeah.
which is an oversight issue, isn't it? So
I think it goes
How do we
about,
tackle that?
it goes about accountability, and I think that you can still create accountability vested in a state. So it goes about natural persons, about citizens of the state, and you can place that accountability by proxy into the hands of those individuals. Where the ownership lies, for me, is absolutely academic. You know, if I take a look at what would happen in South Africa, for example, if direct foreign investment was allowed up to 100%, there would be a flood of capital being invested into the industry, and I think it would transform the industry. One of the constraints that we have is access to capital. You know, we talk about the balance sheet and your ability to attract new aircraft onto a balance sheet, easily done by way of leasing, but not easily done by putting the debt and the equity onto your balance sheet, because it has to be able to carry it. So if you've got the recapitalization of business and investing in new equity in a business by foreign investors, you know, it'll change the complexion completely of the industry. So I think it's a restriction that governments should relook at. And I think, you know, the Chicago Convention is 1944, with respect. That's a few years ago. Things have moved since then. The cheese has moved.
Tebogo, I mean, SAA is in that situation at the moment. You've got to go to the market, or you're also looking for another strategic investor. Give us a sense of, you know, where does it leave you? I mean, how do you attract an investor?
So,
given the fact that your previous attempt at an equity investor didn't go anywhere. I promise not to put him on the spot.
and you did. And you did. So okay. So, it's an open secret. It is very clear to everybody else. The South African Airways, the shareholder wants an equity partner for South African Airways. South African Airways needs an equity partner. No doubt about that. South African Airways would do better with a private equity partner who also has controlling stake in South African Airways. Yes, I am also of the view that the ownership control laws that subsist in South Africa need to change. No one is going to put a lot of money that we need for 25% of the company, particularly if that investor is a foreigner. It's different if it's a South African. But we haven't started looking for a substitute equity investor. We haven't started. Or if they have started, I don't know, because I'm not the one who's going to look for somebody to buy me. That's the job of the owner. So in the meantime, we are going out there in the market to look for funding. Hopefully, an investor will come. If there's anybody here, come and see me. I know some people that I can introduce you to get this thing going. We are vested in preparing South African Airways for that equity investor. How we conduct ourselves. You are talking about governance. Unlike private companies, we have to jump far more hoops in terms of governance. And it's true. There is no man who has money will put money in a leadership particularly, because that's the other thing. Investors also look at the leadership of the organization. A leadership that is reckless. An organization that has no systems. An organization that cares about what the laws are, what rules are. So we've been working hard to do that. And I also think that the reason why our first attempt was not that successful, it is because the company was put in a much better position, and we were able to see without the fog of the pandemic and the business rescue that there is far more value in this organization than what the other investor was prepared to pay for.
But the reality is that there's an unequal playing field, isn't there, between the state-owned airlines and the private airlines. I mean, SA has been able to start again with an unencumbered balance sheet. None of the private airlines have had that opportunity after COVID.
So let me just respond to that.
Yes.
You triggered me there now. So I told some people in another forum, we are not policymakers. We are not. If the state wants to have an airline, you can shout as much as you like. The state will have an airline. So, but this so-called unequal playing field is also not so fair when it comes to South African Airways. Because the amount of things that I am supposed to comply with to get going are far more restrictive than what a private airline has. That is why I am saying this airline, for it to succeed going forward, needs a private owner who either, in fact, has to have a controlling stake in the airline. But it's actually not correct that they are unequal playing field. In fact, it would be much better if everybody else have to wait, Rodger waits for me to get all the route rights, get all the passenger numbers, and then say, okay, I'm not able now to carry them. Rodger, you can go ahead and do that. No, we don't. I'm still expected to compete in the marketplace. Like he is competing with me. So, yet, on the other, some other times, both my hands are tied behind my back, and I'm still expected to run faster than him.
Rodger, do you want to respond to that?
Thank you. Tebogo.
Rodger.
I think best you get out there and start training.
Okay. I mean, there are other issues as well, isn't there? I mean, there are labor issues, for example, or there are airlines in Africa that can't fly to the European Union. I mean, those kind of issues surely also impact on how attractive you are to financiers and investors. What do you say, Ade?
Yes, well, we don't have any restrictions, actually. We're actually planning to start flights to the UK later this year. But definitely there are restrictions that exist for some airlines, and even within Africa itself, it becomes a bit challenging to fly into some places. I didn't want to bring this up, but now that you've mentioned it, operating in Africa is difficult in itself, and now having to get all these regulatory challenges and having to overcome them, it's a problem. We recently leased an aircraft, a South Africa registered aircraft, to boost the fleet on a short-term ACMI, and this was approved by the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa. And 6 weeks down, I still don't have authority to fly the aircraft into South Africa. Those are the kind of challenges that we have to deal with. So definitely these restrictions exist, and they don't also help us in trying to be able to make the best of the network that we are trying to build to become profitable as an airline.
Yeah. And Nowel, again, from your perspective, I mean, TAAG is still state-owned, but you're looking down the line at privatization. At what stage are you going to get there, and depends on the profitability of the airline?
So we're on track with the plan. We recently developed, in association and in collaboration with Lufthansa Consulting, a business plan for the next 5 years, which is full implementation starts this year and it's ongoing, to pull ourselves out gradually from state financing after the support, and to be able to make the airline stable and sustainable, to be able to continue on its feet without the state support constantly. But generally, as we know, it goes beyond having a business plan, because, of course, business plans can be developed by good financial institutions, good consulting companies. It is more about the leadership and the governance culture in the airlines on implementing that business plan, on looking at the cost structure and approach, productivity, accountability, and even on the safety and security records. So there is a bigger challenge of not only just presenting a business plan, which most airlines and most consulting firms can do, but it's about how do you put that effectively into use to make the airlines and pull the airlines to be sustainable. Because at the end of the day, sustainability, it's what keeps the airline going. In Africa, we come back and forth to this aspect of airlines going off and then coming back, going off and coming back with new names. And this continuity we see permanently as government changes. Because as the government stays, the government continues to inject money because they want the airline to fly, they want the airline to be the flag carrier. When the tenure on the mandate is over, the new government comes in and says, oh no, we have been spending a lot of money, then they have to close it down, refinance. That's why we see over 40 airlines in Africa since independence just changing names and continuing to operate on a non-profitable approach. So it's important to move out, even though it is owned by the government. Government should have clear KPIs on the leadership, on the governance policy, and also move out and step out a bit and allow the professionals to run the airlines and be accountable.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I want you each to mention sort of the top 3 things that you are the most crucial in order to attract aircraft finance. Tebogo, let's start with you.
Okay, well, we've said it. It has to be a business plan, but it must be an executable business plan. You have to have a stable leadership, and you also have to have a stable regulatory environment.
Okay.
Those are the 3 things.
Nowel?
For me, it goes beyond the business plan. It's more about leadership and good governance as well, because investors and lenders also invest in people. It's about who is leading and who can protect their money to carry out the plan.
Sanjeev?
I would actually put number 1 as track record, the ability to show growth, the ability to show profitability over a period of time. So track record, I believe, is very important. Leadership, yes, I strongly believe that leadership plays a very important part. And of course, the third part being the business plan. Having a business plan which also comprises of elements of sustainability, because it's all about sustainability right now, the environment and everything that we are actually facing. And I believe sustainability and your ESG policy are also very, very important for an airline, especially when you want to attract financing, because people want to look at what is the future. And are you able to meet the sustainability goals, and the ESG policies are becoming more and more important right now.
Yeah. Rodger?
Yeah, I'd like to turn it on its head and say, there is a lot of investor capital that is ready to flood into a market like Africa, where there is a perception that the market is going to take thousands of aircraft and create so many jobs. And I look at it on the basis of the sustainability element of it, which has to come through consolidation and rationalization, so that you are de-risking the elements that remain in the industry going into the future. There's just not enough space in the market for the expectation that exists, especially amongst the financiers or the potential financiers that could invest in the industry. So that's where I would like to start. I think a lot of the other things have been said. You've got to have a balance sheet. You've got to continue growing equity, which means you have to be profitable, which means you have to have a business case in the first place, which your business model, your business plan going into the future. All of that stuff, I think, is there. It's mandatory. But the biggest element is the expectation of the investor fraternity on what Africa needs. The markets are much smaller. Yes, the population is big and the real estate is massive, as we heard earlier on when we were talking about just Namibia. The whole of Africa as a continent is massive. So we do need air access, but it's got to be done on realistic terms. Then the other point I wanted to raise is, we've heard the debate about state-owned versus not state-owned. And we've seen some state-owned business models which are exemplary, like ET, for example, and the Middle Eastern models, Qatar and Emirates and Etihad. They are all incredible business models. But if you have a look at those business models, there is a full integration of all of the facets of air transportation, including the airport and the airline, and they work in synchronization one with the other. But there is another common element, and that is that they have been premised on monopoly. And that's not what we have when we talk about SATM and opening the whole continent up to free trade. There has to be rationalization, and the business sector has to be privatized to some extent, or everything has to be a monopoly. One of the two. So there's a lot more to it than just, is it a business plan? Is it a balance sheet? What is it? Is it leadership? I think it's all of those things. But
It's the
primarily,
environment,
we have to have realistic expectations on the whole of Africa and what we expect from it. Thank you.
Adil, the last word.
Yeah, I totally agree. In as much as a valid business plan is very key. I know a famous boxer said everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. You can have a fantastic business plan, but if you don't have the good leadership to go along with it, it's all just paper. So I think at the end of the day, it's a myriad of things tied together. In as much as the business plan is key, there must be good vision, there must be good leadership. And then also it depends at what level the airline is. If it's an airline that has been operating for a while, then maybe it's easier. Then you need to look at things like the balance sheet and all of that. For newer airlines, you don't even have the balance sheet to start with. So it comes to the credibility of the people that are leading the business. It comes to the credibility of the business plan that they've put in place. It comes to the credibility of the kind of concepts and route plan that they're trying to develop. And if it makes sense to the investor, then that's something that can go in. So I think those are the things I'd like to discuss on that.
Well, thank you, everyone. It was a great discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. And I think that it was quite wide-ranging, and you've given us also some food for thought. We look forward to hearing the perspective from the financiers tomorrow during a panel discussion moderated by Sean Bendis. And now, John, can we get the results of the poll? Where are they? Oh, there's, right. Which is the most crucial requirement for accessing aircraft finance? Quite overwhelmingly, a feasible business plan, 63%. 19% government support without interference, important and reputable leadership, 14%. And a clean balance sheet, interestingly, only 3%. Thank you very much, everyone.